from Los Angeles, California. Which part of LA are you actually in?
I'm actually in Venice, California. So I live by the ocean.
Amazing. And what is fascinating about yourself is you come from a family where your parents were both physicians, and there are 25 members of your family that were medical professionals, doctors, specialists, and so forth. Is that correct?
That is very correct. Both my parents were physicians. I was an only child of two physician parents, and I have 25 physicians in my family. So I come from a long lineage of rational scientific thinkers. Though for most of the beginning of my life, I did not have an inspiration to become a physician. I never thought that I would, but in terms of my own destiny, I ended up doing that.
But you've really zoned in on a particular way of looking at psychiatry, or how you operate as a professional psychiatrist, and you've really zoned in on the whole question of empathy and what creates what is called an empath. Can you just give us an understanding, particularly those who are watching this all over India and all over the world, just what an empath is, and give us some sense of how you combine the skills of empathetic training, I would suggest, with helping people overcome problems and difficulties with their thinking.
Yes, well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm an MD. I did my medical school at USC, and I did my psychiatric training at UCLA. And I'm also an empath. And what an empath is somebody who is very sensitive and very open, and doesn't usually have the same filters that other people have, so that we sense and feel a lot that's coming in without the same filters or defenses. And so we tend to become emotional sponges and take on the angst of the world, which is an issue that I address in my book, The Empath Survival Guide, how to develop the gifts of being an empath, a sensitive, somebody who cares a lot about other people and the world, but not take on the world's suffering, not take on the people you love, their suffering into your body, though the tendency is to be hyper absorptive in terms of taking on other people's emotions, or even physical discomfort at times. And so as a psychiatrist, I combine my ability to feel empathically with the linear mind and everything I've learned in my conventional medical training. And so by combining empathy with linear science and traditional medicine, it allows me to have different perceptions that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I can incorporate the mind and the heart together in my treatment of patients, which is so inspirational and so gratifying to me in terms of my own work.
So, Judith, what's interesting is when one goes to college, one goes to university, one studies perhaps a postgraduate, people look at what it's like to have an IQ, the intelligence quotient. But would I be correct in saying that what you do in terms of training people to enhance their sense of being empathetic, what you're doing is you're getting them to enhance their EQ, their emotional intelligence?
Absolutely. Empathy is a form of emotional intelligence. What it is, it's saying, you matter to me. The earth matters to me. Kindness matters to me. Being good to myself and empathic with myself matters to me. Empathy is one of the highest values that you can cultivate in your personal life, at work, and in all aspects of living, in terms of how you feel the interconnectivity of everyone here on earth, of our human family. Empathy allows you to connect in that way. And that connection, I believe, is the medicine the world needs. And feeling empathy doesn't make you a softie, or it doesn't make you a pushover. It allows you to open your heart and care, as well as using the discernment of the linear mind. So as I combine in my own practice, in your lives, in your business lives, in your personal lives, you can use the distinction of reason with the power of the heart and empathy, you can have both. And that makes you a more emotionally intelligent human being. And it allows you to develop the highest of human values. The Dalai Lama said the most precious trait we can develop in ourselves is empathy. And I believe that passionately. I believe that it's possible. And I believe that for us to survive as a planet, we must begin to embrace the combination of the heart and the mind.
So why is having empathy for ourselves so challenging? It seems sometimes very difficult for people to construct their own sense of empathy. It's so much easier to help others than to be kind to ourselves. So are you saying that whilst one should have a better developed sense of EQ, emotional intelligence, and empathy, there is a vital importance in having self-empathy as well? Just give us some sense of what you mean by having self-empathy.
Yes, emotional intelligence means having empathy for others, even though you might not agree with them or even like them. I want to specify that. It means having empathy for others. It means seeing where others are coming from, which is that point of connection. Without empathy, you can't have that. And empathy with the self is a high form of emotional intelligence. And it's often harder to give to yourself or to let yourself off the hook than it is to, let's say, help a loved one. Or for me, helping my patients is much easier than helping myself. But empathy for the self is absolutely key to emotional intelligence. And it means not beating yourself up all the time. As I know people, what goes on in their heads, people beat and they're very hard on themselves all the time. And empathy allows you to say, you did a great job today, and it was a hard situation and you did well. And I'm with you, as opposed to, you did a horrible job. You should have done better. You should have pushed yourself hard. All of that, which is so demeaning to the self, to be able to give yourself a break and little by little be kinder to the self. I mean, it sounds like it would be a natural thing for all of us to do, that we'd all be yearning for that kindness. And yet, paradoxically, it's not true, that we must consciously aim for that place of kindness to the self. And the kinder we are to ourselves, the more empathy we can have for our own life's mission, our own life's challenges, whatever they may be, the more we can have empathy for others.
So Judith, you've written 8 books that
I have.
built around this wider area of empathetic development. And one of the books that you recently wrote is called The Empath's Survival Guide to Help Empathic People Develop Their Gifts and Address the Challenges such as compassion burnout. We'll talk about compassion burnout because that's a big issue, particularly in a COVID environment. Taking on the stress of others, exhaustion at work or within a family, let's say a troubled family, and sensory overload. And many people feel shamed about being too sensitive, oftentimes a criticism by tough bosses in the workplace. But just tell us a little bit about the Empath Survival Guide, why you wrote it, and what your focus was in trying to help people who read it.
I wrote the Empath Survival Guide to be able to share with people what it means to have the beautiful gift of sensitivity and how to deal with the challenges involved so you don't become an emotional sponge and take on the suffering of the world. So you're able to be an empowered empath, somebody who is able to feel and sense and care and know, but also be able to set boundaries so you don't absorb other people's issues. There's a certain destiny that each one of us has. And part of empathy and part of having respect for others is giving people the dignity of their own paths. And one thing that empaths do is sometimes they try and fix others, where if you see a loved one suffering, you want to make it better for them. But sometimes of course, that's a natural impulse, but sometimes people have to grow on their own. And you can be there as a loving, supportive force, but you can't do it for them. And that's what empaths often try and do. They want to get in there, take the pain away from your child's suffering, from your spouse's suffering. But to maintain balance, you really need to learn how to set boundaries and be empathic and loving, but let other people follow their own destiny, their own path, and have faith that they're going to know what to do with your support, of course, but letting them live and grow. And empaths, it's very hard for them to do that because they want to take away other people's pain. It's a primal instinct.
To be the blotting paper of someone else's pain. You'd mentioned, you'd spoken about compassion burnout, and in COVID or the COVID pandemic times where we've had to deal with such significant loss, significant concern. Just give us some sense of compassion burnout and how that affects people who are empathetic or who consider themselves to be empathetic in being able to deal with and help other people.
So many of my empaths and empathic patients are feeling burned out from all of the stress in the world. In the last couple of years, there's been so much stress in the world, so much negativity, so many challenging people who are on the world stage right now who are narcissistic in nature. Right. Narcissists are the opposite of empaths. Narcissists who are malignant, full-blown narcissists have empathy deficient disorder. And right. So the empaths are on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I think why so many people are getting exhausted is they're trying to apply their own high values of empathy, emotional intelligence, logic to the narcissist, and they don't operate that way. And so part of the transition, part of relieving the stress is realizing who you're dealing with, whether it's in the workplace with draining people or narcissistic bosses, or if it's happening on a larger global scale, to realize narcissists don't have the same kind of empathy you do or the same conscience. So they have to be dealt with differently, again, depending on your environment where you are. And so that's, I think, part of our global lesson now in terms of empathy. It's learning how to develop it in ourselves, but not expect more from others than they can give, and learn how to deal with them from an empathic point of view, but that doesn't mean you like them or even support what they're doing. It just means you could tune in or try to tune in to where they're coming from. And where narcissists are coming from is control and power. That's what they know, what excites them, as opposed to an empath, or those of you who are on the path of emotional intelligence and developing empathy. What makes you happy is connection and love, and elevating our interconnectivity in the world and creating a better world because we care. But it's important to realize that on the other end of the spectrum, you have the narcissists who do not operate that way. Yes, all they care about is themselves or power and control. So part of empathy is realizing people's limitations, and that's, very important.
So there's been a huge development over the last 20, 25 years in India of the rise of the tech community. Cities like Pune, just outside Mumbai, Bengaluru, Bangalore, Hyderabad, of course, Delhi, and most particularly Mumbai, and people working under tremendous pressure to try and get results in technology, trying to be first and so forth, where a lot of people feel that they are exhausted in the work environment. And especially because you might have a boss that is, let's call them, someone who drains people, a boss that somehow is either narcissistic or very demanding and doesn't necessarily consider that people have feelings too. So this whole notion of very difficult bosses to work with, and I'm not talking only about male bosses, I'm talking about women as well, because of course this is not restricted only to men being either narcissistic or very, very controlling, but just give us a sense about what is sometimes called people who are draining with other people. In other words, they drain away the energy in a room because they are either narcissistic or controlling.
Yes, I think almost everyone can relate to that in terms of being around draining people and having them suck the life force out of you. And part
Yeah.
of being empowered as an empath is learning how to notice what your energy does around people. Does your
Right.
energy go up around certain people, or does it go down around certain people? So you want to go towards the positive, loving ones where you feel comfortable and you're not being drained. But sometimes in the work environment, and as you pointed out in the tech environments, um, there can be a lot of narcissism, a lot of pushing beyond your limit. And so it's important to learn how to deal with narcissists, meaning lower your expectations. And if you want something from a narcissist, let's say a narcissistic boss, you have to frame things in terms of how it serves them. It's
So give us an
tedious.
example of what that might be. Let us just say you've had to deal with both narcissism and a very controlling kind of personality. What would you recommend?
Well, let's say you'd like to take a vacation and you're tired and you really need a break. Instead of saying that to the narcissistic boss, you have to say something like, I think it will benefit the business if I take these days off. Because I think financially and productivity wise, it would be wiser if I did that. So if you frame
Right.
it in terms of how it will serve the boss is more likely to say yes. If you say, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I need to take a break, they could care less. And I know that's hard to get. So I work with a lot of empaths and I do empathy trainings and I work with a lot of people who value empathy, but it's hard to get that narcissists don't care about your feelings, not really, unless it serves them.
So when one thinks of people who are draining, give us some other ways in which that draining mechanism impacts upon a company or even a family. Of course, there are many families that perhaps are troubled families, maybe a husband and wife that are just not compatible, and that filters down through to the kids. But I was also trying to think of which companies you know, and particularly in terms of tech or in in modern technologies, do have a great culture. I know, for example, that Starbucks, the coffee company that was started in Seattle in America, always prided itself on the fact that people were team members and not necessarily employees. But there are companies that do construct a culture that is inclusive and tries to move away from narcissism and control, does it not?
Oh, yes. There are a number of companies like that. And I think it's important that if you're in the workplace, that you identify the draining people. It's important in a culture for human resources to be open to working with people in terms of wellness, in terms of emotional intelligence, and identifying the draining people. There are different types that can really drain a workplace. One of which is the victim, somebody who is poor me, everything's happening to me, and will never accept any kind of solutions. And the empathic person, in turn, will listen to them and be brought down. The energy will be brought down, and you might listen on the phone for 2 hours to this person, and you're exhausted, and they feel better. Then they call you the next day, or they come up to your desk the next day, and you don't know how to say no. It's important to learn how to set boundaries with the victim person so that you don't encourage their dumping, emotional dumping onto you. And so you have to learn to say, I care about you, but I've got to get back to this project now. And if you want to talk about solutions, I'm here for you, but otherwise I got to get off the phone. So
Right.
you have to learn how to set boundaries in a kind but firm tone, not apologetic, not getting into a big confrontation, but learning how to set a limit on how long you spend with somebody. And that's hard, but it's a good practice. I don't know how I would survive as an empath without learning how to set boundaries. To say, no, I'm tired. I'm so sorry I can't go out. Or no, I can't see you as a patient today. I don't have any room today. To be able to just set boundaries so as much as possible so that I'm comfortable with my empathy. I want to keep my empathy alive and open and vital. I don't want to become so tired and burn out that I don't even want to feel empathy. And so in the workplace, it's so important that leaders are in touch with the power of empathy and how to develop it, in employees, in managers, and how to nurture that. And part of that means learning how to identify people in the workplace who are the drainers and helping people deal with them and speaking to the drainers themselves. They might not even be aware. For instance, if you have a chronic talker, they could just talk and talk and talk and talk and tell you their life story, and you're trying to do your work, you're trying to focus on being creative, and they suck the energy right out of you. And so it's important with chronic talkers to interrupt. You have to interrupt them and say, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I have got to go on to my work now. Good luck with this. I'm glad I spoke to you, but now I've got to go on. So you have to learn these little tricks in the workplace, but the tone and how you communicate empathically. If you can say a positive yes, you can set a positive limit with people and they can hear it. You don't have to be punitive or snippy or nasty. You can just, if you listen to my tone as I'm sharing this with you, you can see it's a positive tone, and it's a positive no. I'm sorry, I can't do this right now.
Right. So here's a question. You've got quite a number of Indian clients that you help with therapy, and you have people actually working on Zoom or Team or Google Calls with you, where you can give them advice and help, and you do this. Give us some kind of sense as to what some of the problems are that you've dealt with. I mean, I know you work a lot with people in the technology space and in the business community, but particularly in terms of India, just give us some sense of some of the elements that might have been raised, just in a general sense, not of course asking about specific patients, but trying to get a sense of how this works in India.
Well, in my experience, it's work-related a lot in terms of how to maintain your empathy and be empowered in the workplace around bosses who may not be, as supportive as you would like. And my work in empathy training and developing somebody's empathy also involves developing their strength and their sense that if they proceed in a certain way, they could gather allies and they can gather support so they could help them in the work environment. And I've often encountered the attitude, oh, this person has so much more power than I do. How will I ever be able to change anything? And, that's not the proper way to address it. You can have empathy for yourself, saying this boss is extremely difficult to deal with. And sure, they have a certain amount of power, but so do you. And you can take these actions to empower yourself in the workplace, as well as being empathic for yourself and empathic for your coworkers, as you make a change of how you view the boss. So the disempowerment is very common. And I want to help people develop their empathy, not shut off, not become numb, not become hardened or steeled up all the time, but able to recognize their own power so that they don't feel that they don't have power in the workplace, that they can't go for their creative projects, that they can't put in unique ideas, or they can't, work in a milieu in a creative way. One must learn, and I've counseled so many people, how to deal with narcissistic bosses or managers or people who, quote, have the power, and how to work with them instead of being demolished by them.
So here's a question for you. Bullying is such a big issue in modern society, and particularly with social media, the way that it amplifies maybe the worst in people, or some people at any rate. But bullying is really at crisis proportions in many industries. And people often ask, what is it that makes someone become a bully? Is this because they come from, let's say, a family where there hasn't been a happy upbringing, and maybe there have been difficulties psychologically within the family? But from your point of view, looking at it as a psychiatrist, and particularly an empathetic psychiatrist, What makes people become bullies? Are they wounded? Are they insecure? What makes someone become a bully? And then how would an empath be able to actually counter someone's bullying approach in a working situation?
Yes, empathy for a bully. That's an interesting topic, isn't it? And people are probably thinking, why in the world would you want that? What I've seen with a number of there are different types of bullies, but with some types of bullies that they've been abused as children and they've been bullied themselves. So it's their way of trying to maintain some kind of semblance of power. And having empathy, you're not forgiving the bullying. And of course, you want to have zero tolerance for bullying. And if you're a parent who has a child who's being bullied, you want to get into that school and advocate for that child, or in the workplace, you want to have HR advocate for that employee who's being bullied by somebody else. All right. But in terms of the why and the psychological profiles of bullying, having past history of bullying, and also bullies can be narcissists where they don't have the same kind of conscious measurement of stopping. They don't know any kind of consciousness to stop bullying or why it would be wrong. They're psychopathic. And so they're coming from a different place and they need to be stopped, basically. You can't give a bully any leeway. They need to be stopped in one way or another. And empaths are often attracted to narcissists, and narcissists are attracted to empaths. A little bit different than bullying. Narcissists are not always bullies, but sometimes they are. And empaths are attracted to narcissists because they see the false self in the beginning, the charming, seductive. This could be a boss, or it could be a love interest. It could be a friend. They're charming and seductive, and they seem to care about you and have empathy. But the minute you don't do things according to their rules, they become cold, withholding, punishing, or have gaslighting where they try and make you seem like you're crazy. And so it's a very destructive pattern. And so empaths need to be able to see through, and empathic people, to preserve yourself, to be with a healthy, loving relationship. You need to be able to identify narcissists, which I talk about in the Empath Survival Guide, how to identify them, how to say no to them, how to deal with them if you can't get away, such as in a workplace environment. It's an important dynamic to look at, if you're empathic, because you deserve to be loved, and malignant narcissists don't have that capability, really.
So, Judith, we're getting in some wonderful questions. And in fact, to all of you in the audience that are watching, both from India and, of course, internationally, we get a lot of people from many countries. We're getting some fabulous questions coming in. A lot are being sent anonymously, but we are very discreet about the way we deal with these things. And here's a question from Anita R. And Anita says, I'm still trying to balance empathy with anxiety and hyper-vigilance. Do you have any tips, Dr. Orloff, as to how to be able to discern between anxiety and hyper-vigilance?
Yes. Well, sometimes if you're an empath, and you can take the 20-question self-assessment test in the beginning of the Empath Survival Guide, if you're an empath, one of the symptoms is hyper-vigilance, because you're constantly scanning your environment to make sure it's safe. And that might have come from an unsafe environment when you were growing up. But the secret to dealing with hypervigilance is to be able to set boundaries a little bit more with whatever is uncomfortable in your life. And there's a difference between anxiety and empathy. And empathy is where your heart just goes out to somebody and you feel what they're feeling. Your anxiety might come from being an empath. I suspect that it is, because you may take on the anxiety of others. Maybe it's your mother, maybe it's other people. But empaths often need to ask themselves, is this emotion, is this anxiety for you mine, or is it somebody else's? And if it's somebody else's, you have to learn techniques such as breathing it out, or calming yourself down, or getting to a centered place, so that you can calm the anxiety and then be open to your empathy. So it requires a shift in you, but examine if you're an empath. Really, take a look at some of the symptoms of being an empath, the hyper-vigilance being one of them, the sensitivity, the creativity, the connection to nature being others. Those are the positive parts. But if you're an empath and you're anxious, you might take on the anxiety of other people, and it's something to be aware of so you can observe, not absorb.
So here's an interesting question from Tushar Mishra. Tushar, I don't know where you're sending this in to us from, and those of you that do have questions, it would be great just for you to tell us which town or city or village you're from in India. And Tushar asks this to you, Dr. Orloff: if being empathetic beyond a point gives you stress, why have empathy at all?
Empathy is a trait inside of you that will increase your energy, it will increase your goodness, and it will increase your connection to yourself and others. There's so many things that cause us stress, but how we deal with stress is another issue. You don't have to open up your empathy. It's something that you do if you're attracted to it. And if you feel that the stress involved in opening yourself up is too much, you can do it very slowly, little by little by little. But what it does, it connects you to yourself and to others and to nature, and it brings many beautiful things in your life. And as an empath or an empathic person, you must learn to center yourself, to breathe out stress, to be able to use techniques such as visualization, meditation, setting boundaries, being kinder to yourself and your own mind. All these things will help you to relieve the stress that might come from being so sensitive and increase all of the gains that come. So I hope that answered your question.
That's an interesting question. We've got one here from Shailesh. I don't know where Shailesh is sending us from, but Shailesh asks this of you, Dr. Orloff: how can organizations develop a healthy work culture with empathy? What are some guidelines that you might suggest?
Yes, that's why I feel so strongly about empathy training for organizations, is that you need to have education about how to bring empathy into the workplace. What does it look like? What is empathy? What would it look like in your teams? What would it look like in your organization? What are some empathy statements that you can use? Just one simple one is, what you're going through sounds like it's really hard now. I really feel for you. Something like that. If somebody's upset in the workplace, this is one small example, but it's powerful. Someone's upset or stressed out in the workplace, simply your empathy, it's very powerful in an organization to learn how to speak to your coworkers, saying empathic statements, but not getting overly involved with them so you're trying to fix them. So all of this requires some education, some practice, working with different people. What does it mean to be empathic? What does too much empathy mean? How do I express it in, a situation? How do I perhaps hold back my empathy and not get overly involved with certain situations? So learning the parameters of what empathy is, what healthy empathy is, what giving too much can look like, and how to develop a balance of empathy and reason, and using the mind and the heart together at work can only increase productivity. It increases communication. Because just think about it. If you're genuinely caring about your coworker instead of being irritated by them, or being put off or putting, off vibes that you don't like them that much, it's a very different situation. Whereas if you could be trained to how are you doing today? You look great. People love to hear that, to be able to say positive things. You're working so hard, in technology and, all of the creative industries, you're working so hard. You need your mind to be free. You need to be in a positive environment, and learning how to train yourself and being trained with empathy in the workplace can elevate the milieu so much, and the culture can be happier and healthier when you have empathy, as opposed to not having empathy, as opposed to just being burnout, tired, and not as creative as you could be because you're exhausted. And so you have to begin to shift that with, what does healthy empathy look like in the workplace? I love this subject. But I'll stop here.
Okay, here's a terrific question from Kiran Bhatia. Kiran, I don't know where you've sent this in from, but Judith, here's the question. Kiran asks, how can one draw a line between being self-empathetic and being self-centered? Good question.
That's a very nice question. Self-empathetic is not being self-centered. It's about caring for the self, just as you would a little child or a loved one. The self, your relationship to the self is very precious. Being self-centered is only thinking of yourself. And that's not what I'm suggesting. It's not putting you first in every situation. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that you talk to yourself in a nice way, in your own head. When you go home after a hard day, when you've had a lot of things happen in the day, you say nice things to yourself up here. That's not being self-centered. That's being compassionate. And you deserve that kindness. Self-centered is something else. Self-centered, and everybody becomes a little self-absorbed now and then. So it's a natural part of being human. But self-centered is putting yourself first all the time. And that's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm talking about kindness to the self in very simple ways. It's very hard. It's harder than you might think. It's easier to be kind to the person who is unhoused than it is to be yourself, kind to yourself sometimes, or saying, you've been through a lot lately. Take a break, take a breath, exhale, be kind to yourself. You've been through a lot. I'm sorry you've been hurt. This is an empathy meditation that I present. I'm sorry you've been hurt. For all the people who hurt you in your past who have not been able to apologize. Part of self-empathy is just, I'm sorry you've been hurt, and I'm going to be taking better care of myself. As the guardian of myself, relationship to the self, relationship to others, relationship to colleagues, relationship to communities, relationship to the earth. This is all very important, but the self is key.
So, Judith, this is interesting. It's almost like saying when I wake up in the morning, I should look in the mirror and say to the mirror when I see myself, you're great, I think you're terrific. I mean, that sounds a little bit perhaps false, but here's an interesting question from Shailendra Jain, which I think touches on some of these points I've just mentioned. How do you deal with selective empaths? They go out of their way to do anything for someone who they cherish, thinking of every possibility of helping and not hurting them, but while harming dozens in the process consciously and repeatedly, what Shailendra is calling selective empaths. What do you think of that?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting point. That's not really being an empath, because the hurting of others, empaths are kind of wired to not do that. It's too painful. When, if I hurt another person, if I hurt an animal, if I hurt a bug, it just hurts me. It's too much. And empaths need to learn to balance that. And so I would suggest that I don't think you're referring to yourself. You might be referring to somebody that you know. It's not really an empath who's doing that. It's somebody who's giving for reasons other than being an empath. And sometimes people give in order to be liked, in order to think of themselves as good people. But if they hurt people if the flip side of it is the hurting of people. I would question if they were a genuine empath. I would question their motives for giving. Wouldn't be a classic empath. So that's my sense from what you just presented.
So here's an interesting question from Sachdev Ramakrishna. I don't know where Sachdev is sending this from, but the question is as follows. Dr. Orloff, by style, says Sachdev, I'm an empathetic business leader. However, as I deal with teams in certain regions of the world where the style of management has been conventionally authoritarian, I am seen as a contrarian. What is your counsel on this?
Oh, that's you. Congratulations, bravo on your good work. I mean, this, I can feel what you've given to the world, and thank you for that. That's a very interesting question. If you go into an authoritarian style, you might want to integrate that a little bit to be a little more authoritarian than you're used to, and bring in empathy with that so they don't feel it's so strange. You know, it might be very strange to them to have an empathic style. Sometimes you have to speak the language of the people that you're communicating with, and weave that into the picture. It's okay to be a little bit more authoritarian and authoritative, in your approach, just simply to make them more comfortable. And with that basic authoritative stance, you could start to bring in little by little empathy, because maybe they can't take it in terms of the degree that you're presenting it, because they're coming from a different place. So when, in my empathy trainings, I teach people to start where somebody is coming from, try and speak their language. And you try and be empathic with where they're coming from, not necessarily just your own perspective. And so then you could begin to blend and work with that person or work with that team or organization to expand their empathy in the way that they feel comfortable. So you've got to start with what makes them feel comfortable and use their language, not just your own.
So here's an interesting question from Nikhil Priya. Nikhil asks the following. Sometimes in the workplace, the seniors are not clear while delegating tasks, and then when a mistake is committed, it's the juniors that are in hot water. How does one handle it?
That is true. And what is the question?
Is that common in America too, Judith?
Oh, yes, of course. They just want to delegate they want to put the blame on somebody else because they can't be accountable. No, that's infuriating, isn't it? But it happens. And what is the actual question? I understand that that's a very frustrating dynamic. What is the question, Ralph?
The question is, how does one handle this notion of where seniors are not clear in their delegating of tasks, and when a mistake is committed because maybe they were not clear, it's the junior employees that are in hot water? How does one handle this?
Hopefully you find a senior who might be open to having an honest conversation about this, if there is one. You find the best possible senior, and you could begin to talk to them about that, or to find an ally who's maybe also a senior, but maybe a more empathic senior from somewhere else in the organization, and you see what they can offer this to this situation. But in terms of you being a junior, having to bear the blame, I think you need to really state that this was not your doing, that I would have done it a different way. And somehow bring that in without blaming. I wouldn't say, well, he did it and he's just dumping it on me. I would say, ideally, this is the way I would approach it. And so you sidestep it without blaming the senior. It's a little dance. It's a Zen dance to do that. But the whole priority is to present your idea on how you would solve the situation, rather than getting into blaming the senior for blaming you. So that's not a dynamic you want to get into, because that's a no-win dynamic. So you want to kind of shift it a little bit to make it about your goal and how you would solve the situation.
So here's an interesting question from Avani Jain. Can Dr. Orloff tell us something about her other book called Thriving as an Empath? Obviously, there are many books that you've written, Judith, but this is something that Avani wants to know about, thriving as an empath. Any comments?
Yes, Thriving as an Empath is a book of self-care techniques for empaths. And it's dedicated to each day of the year, starting January 1st, ending December 31st. And each day there are 2 or 3 paragraphs on how you can practice self-care as an empath. And so each day it will take maybe a few minutes to read, but to practice and to contemplate and to meditate on how do you observe emotions without absorbing them. That's one of the techniques.
That's such a great way to observe rather than absorb.
Yes, exactly. Because empaths and empathic people, well, they want to take away your pain. They want to take away my pain. They just want to do that naturally. And that's not a healthy thing to do. It's about how do I set boundaries is another technique in thriving as an empath. How do I learn to say no? How do I learn to know what my boundaries are so I don't get enmeshed with my family or my coworkers? How do I set clear boundaries? How do I take alone time? Because empaths often need to have time alone to decompress. How do I stop sensory overload? There's a day devoted to that. One of the contemplations in the book, one of the days is how do you stop sensory overload? If too much is coming at you too fast, how do you calm it down? And so each day in Thriving as an Empath offers you a tip to practice. So it's very solution oriented. And I think you'll enjoy it if you're empathic and you'd like to find techniques to center yourself so you don't feel overloaded.
So Judith, here's something interesting I'd love to ask you to speak about, and that is the misconceptions of empathy. How is it misconceived? I know some people are called crybabies. Some relationships say that empathy is misconstrued or misconceived. And even in sports teams, you find that there are certain misconceptions. So what can you tell us about the misconceptions of empathy? And in those particular areas, crybabies is one in particular, because sometimes people are accused of, oh, well, you're always complaining, you're always the crybaby.
Right. For millennia, empaths have been shamed for their sensitivities. Sensitive people have been called crybabies, whiners, you don't have a thick enough skin, you need to be stronger, you're a weakling, all kinds of things. And it's caused incredible damage to sensitive children to be called this. I was shamed for my own abilities as a little girl. I was told, dear, just get a thicker skin by my 2 physician parents who loved me. That was the tape they had. A lot of parents had going back then. And even now, get a thicker skin. You're never going to make it in this world unless you toughen up and you steel up. And I interpreted that as a child that there was something wrong with me, that there was something I had to be ashamed of. And it wasn't until years later when I, was told, and I truly believe this, that in order for me to be whole, I needed to incorporate my sensitivities and my intuition and my empathy into my being along with the linear mind in order to integrate. And so, as sensitive people, you might be called all kinds of things, and they're not true. None of them are true. All right. It's a bias. It's a misconception. And I think the world is evolving, a lot, when it comes to sensitivity and empathy, but not everybody is evolved. So you want to be really wise who you go to with certain things. And, I've been interviewed by, the media on, is it safe to cry in the workplace or to have empathy and to express your feelings in the workplace? And the answer is no, not always. No, it might not be appropriate to do that. So, it just, the topic is a hot topic, in terms of how we're going to survive as a civilization. And in the workplace, wherever we are, how are we going to survive? Are we going to be able to find this empathy in ourselves or not? I mean, I don't see how we're going to survive without it, honestly. I really don't. This is our connection. It connects me to you. It connects me to everyone in India who is on this call. It connects me to everyone in the world who is on this call. As a human family, we're all connected, and empathy lets you know that. And in terms of the person who asked the question about, well, it's stressful to develop empathy. Yes, but you also get this connection, and this connection is everything. There is no us versus them. It's only one family, one being, and empathy lets you know that. And when you know that, I mean, in a way, you won't feel lonely anymore, because, you know, wherever you are, there's the human family. And in the workplace, you know, that's a philosophy to communicate. You know, and in terms of a culture in a workplace with thousands and thousands of employees, that's something to communicate in terms of the connectivity between everyone in that culture. And that no one is better than or less than. It's about working together towards a goal. And when you have that happening, your productivity, your happiness level, your inspiration only increases so much.
So, Judith, here's an interesting question that's posed by someone that sent a question, and they've said this. They say in any company, there's usually a CEO, a chief executive officer. Shouldn't there be a CEO, but not chief executive officer, but chief empathy officer? What do you think of that?
Yes.
Would you recommend companies have a chief empathy officer?
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that needs to be initiated ASAP. We need a chief empathy officer in every company in order to bring that awareness into the workplace. I love that idea. I hope everyone hears that and begins to initiate that.
Okay, so you heard it first from Dr. Judith, who says that there should be a chief empathy officer in every Indian company, those tech companies in Pune that are working 24/7, 8 days a week. This is something to do. Judith, here's an interesting question that arrives from Amit, who writes in. We don't know where he or she is sending it from, but the question is this. How, and we know there are a lot of parents that are watching this particular TEDx gateway, how can we teach empathy to children?
Oh, that is key. How you begin as early as possible. First of all, you need to see if your child is an empath. Empaths have certain needs. You know, again, they might not want to be on sports teams. They might love going out in nature, walking in the woods. They might not be able to tolerate play dates back to back, and they need more time and space and creativity and imagination, alone time. So you have to determine if the child is an empath and support their needs rather than trying to put them in a role that isn't theirs, that force them into situations that are overstimulating and that won't help the child grow. But empathy can be taught by saying, I care about another person. And if your child comes in and says, I feel overwhelmed at school, you know, this person was mean to me, you listen with empathy. The best way to teach empathy is to model it. So if you as a parent can model empathy and encourage the child to talk to you about where they're hurt or what they're feeling, or if they love the woods, or if they love this, or if they, you know, feel like they need alone time, or they're talking to their imaginary friend, you know, you're right there with them. You know, you're listening to them, you're with them. That's empathy, is being present with somebody and not telling them they have to be a certain way. No, you should be more sensitive. No, you're, you know, not perceiving it. You just listen to the child and you say, that's really beautiful that you feel that way. That's so beautiful. You care about your friend. And maybe you need, when you get overwhelmed, or you need to quiet down and have some quiet time. And I'll, teach you how to do that. So you work with your child to keep the heart open and learn also how to set healthy boundaries from the very beginning.
So here's a great question from Tuhina Ratti, who's from New Delhi. And Tuhina asks the following question. As faculties, and obviously talking about faculties in education, we have been given a project to deliver social, ethical, emotional learning curriculum to students. That's social, ethical, emotional learning. My question is, if one is not compassionate or empathetic herself or himself, how can he or she deliver such a curriculum to students? Shouldn't teachers be trained to become compassionate first before they make students learn?
Oh, yes, ideally, of course. But I think teachers need to be revered a lot more than they are and get paid a lot more than they are. And so they're not burnt out, as many teachers are burnt out because I don't know what the classrooms are like in India, but the classrooms here, unless children go to private schools, are gigantic, and they're unruly. And so the teachers, of course, need to be compassionate and empathic. But sometimes, as we talked about before earlier in my talk, compassion burnout can happen. And so the teachers need to be healed themselves. But as you say, ideally, yes, the teachers need to be schooled in empathy themselves and learn a little bit. What is self-empathy? How can I teach this child self-empathy? How can I model empathy for someone? How can I help a child if they're hurting so much because they're overloaded by everything that's coming in? So if you model empathy, you can be the best teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're in the workplace, whether you're starting this amazing curriculum that it sounds like, you're involved with. But yes, ideally. But also, there are a lot of limitations when it comes to teacher because of the burnout element, and they deserve a lot of empathy because of that. And so, and I've got to say, sometimes, and it almost seems inexplicable, people can teach what they can't do themselves sometimes. And so I don't know who you're talking about specifically in terms of your curriculum, but if they're able to transmit it to the child, that's worth something too. So it's important to look at individuals and what they're able to teach, and how much they've been able to grow in terms of their own empathic development.
So Judith, you presently are writing a book which you are calling Radical Empathy, and you're deep in the book. When will the book be? When do you feel or think that you would have finished writing the book? What does your empathetic radar tell you about your writing?
Probably next year. I get deep into a project, and this is not simply about empaths, as I've written about before. This is about the greater umbrella of empathy in general, which is such an important topic to me. And so I immerse myself in it, in order to be able to communicate, the teachings of empathy to the best of my ability. And that for me takes some alone time, a lot of alone time, being alone in a room and connecting and teaching what I know. In any case, Radical Empathy will probably be finished next year, hopefully. And I want to offer it, to the workplace and to the world as a way to help bring empathy more into our everything, into everyday life, and to help with the resistances to it, and to help with why I can't do it. And I love the question about what is it too stressful to do? Why should I do it? And, working through all that, that's what this book is about, is the empathy training and working through how do I get to an empathic place? Because I think that is the goal. I know that is the goal. And so I want to help you all get there. This is a call to action, really. This talk that we're having, this conversation, this dialogue, it's a call to action for everyone here to search for the empathy in themselves, to ask yourself, is this a value I want to cultivate as an individual, in the workplace, in the world? Is it something I value? And if it is, then there is a path to developing it. And there are obstacles to overcome, which I will help you get over in my writings. But is this a path you want to go towards? And if so, it will give you a certain purpose and destiny when you follow it. And to me, it's the most worthwhile path one can go on. But you have to make up that decision for yourself.
Well, Judith, I have to say this has really been a fantastic session. Just the guidance, the tips, the sensibility that you've given us has been incredibly helpful. And I'm sure that everybody all over India who has become acquainted with you, perhaps for the first time, or certainly become aware of your work, this is really great. And then also, thanks so much for that question about suggesting every company should have a chief empathy officer. That's something that's a takeaway from this. Judith, thank you so much for joining us from Los Angeles, Venice, California, which is just near Santa Monica, which is in Los Angeles. You were really fantastic. I know that people really warmed to what you'd said and the guidance that you gave. So thank you. And now it gives us an opportunity to just take our TEDx Gateway audience in India and around the world about some of our upcoming TEDx Gateway talks. So Judith, thank you so much, and good night to you. And before we sign off, we've got a great event coming up on the 8th of January after the New Year's break, where we'll have Anirudh Krishna, who is a professor of public policy and professor of political science, achieving excellence by investing in talent ladders. Very interesting. Professor Krishna is certainly well known in this field, and that should be a really great one on Saturday, the 8th of January at 6 p.m. IST. We then go from that on the 14th of January, Professor Bobby Duffy, who is the director of the Policy Institute at King's College in London, very, very important international university. And the talk is The Generation Myth, Why when you're born matters less than you think. So in other words, if you were born in the last 20 years, why is it that that actually matters less than you think? It's more about what you choose to do rather than where you're born, because a lot of people think that maybe if you're not born in a big city or you're not born in a successful family, you can't be successful. But of course, that's not true. So that's The Generation Myth on Friday, the 14th of January at 6 p.m. IST. That should be terrific, with Professor Bobby Duffy, very important professor at King's College London. Then on January the 21st, which soft skills or human skills will take you into the future of work? Bailey Parnell is the founder and CEO of the Skills Camp, Soft Skills Training, very important organization, and she will share insights on the most important skills for your success in the future of work and the red flags to look out for. So don't miss, this could be a good prescription for your own future. We've got, what comes next after this, Pankaj? Here we are. Michaela Musilova, who's an astrobiologist and a director of High Seas. And this is a fascinating session on the 29th of January, preparing for a life beyond Earth. That should be good. Building settlements on the moon or Mars, obviously something that Elon Musk has got his mind focused on. And then on the 12th of February, we've got Aparna Mehta, who's the Vice President of Global Customer Solutions at United Parcel Service, one of the biggest delivery services in the world. And Aparna, who is an accomplished logistics and supply chain leader, talks about the impact of the supply chain and how to improve it. So just look at that on your screen. Terrific events. And of course, these will be coming up, so don't miss them. They will all enhance you and make you think really well and positively and productively. That could enhance your work and your family life. So thank you to all of you that have watched today, and to our production team for the successful webinar series. Yashraj Akashi, the curator and licensee, and in terms of content, Priyanka Patil, Himali Gandhi, Anisha Dalvi. Anisha, special thanks to you. Tech support from Gaurav Rawat and Pankaj Jeshwani. Always great production team. Omkar Patki in creative, Rashmi Shetty, video production, and of course, Joanna D'Souza. Thank you so much to our production team, to all of you all over the world, to all of you all over India, and especially to Dr. Judith Orloff, who is our special guest. We say Bahut Dhanyavad, and wishing you all the very best in your day today in India. From Ralph Simon in LA, All the best to you.